It's 18th of June 1940. France has asked for peace terms from the invading Germans.
It's a disaster which would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. So how will Prime Minister Winston Churchill respond?
Join us for the story of one of the most memorable speeches in history here on Churchill, the Finest Half Hour.
Welcome to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Dr. Warren Dockter, and with me is my partner in crime, Richard Toye. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Warren. How are you?
Doing very well. So where we last left off in this amazing epic story is the fall of France. And I wonder, obviously, how did Churchill respond, but also how did people around Churchill respond to the fall of France?
Well, there's a kind of a mixed reaction, I would say. Remember that the actual armistice terms weren't known immediately, so there was a little bit of hanging on with bated breath going on with the public in general. But some leading people in Britain were actually quite relaxed. So the King, George VI, he said, "I feel happier now that we have no allies to be polite to and pamper." And equally, Sir Hugh Dowding, who was the head of RAF Fighter Command, and he was obviously going to have this huge job in repelling the Luftwaffe during the upcoming Battle of Britain, he said, "Thank God we are alone now." Now, historians argue about exactly what alone meant, because, of course, Britain did have its empire still, wasn't quite entirely alone, but there was certainly this slightly xenophobic reaction in certain quarters saying, "Oh, good, now we don't actually have to fight alongside all these kind of irritating foreigners."
Right, so you have these people that kind of imagine it's not actually that big a deal that France has fallen. But perhaps more interestingly, in terms of diplomatic relations, President Roosevelt that America saw it in a I think a pretty significant light. But the question is, do you think that Roosevelt saw it as something that was utterly catastrophic? Do you think that he used his language to try to engage people to come around to helping Britain?
Roosevelt is always very difficult to read, an ambiguous character. As we discussed in a previous episode, that he'd been successful to some extent in getting Churchill to make this public commitment in his speech of 4th of June that if Britain were to fall, then sort of the empire beyond the seas would carry on fighting. And remember, Britain obviously has not fallen at this stage. And so Churchill's speech had been very well received in the United States because the British Navy was going to carry on fighting, and that was an additional aspect of security for the Americans. So I don't think there's pure panic in America. A lot of people still think, well, this is a conflict that's a long way away. It's not really anything to do with us. But certainly Roosevelt did tell Congress that the fall of France is something with dire consequences for American security.
Right. He framed it as a watershed in the history of the world, which I think is really powerful words from Franklin Roosevelt. But as you said, it's really difficult to understand him the way he frames things. He's a very mercurial figure. Well, what about closer to Churchill and his war cabinet? I mean, it seemed like, if you look at the war minutes, that it's almost such a heinous idea that they wouldn't even name it.
Well, that's right. There's this talk in government documents of plans to meet a certain eventuality, that is the fall of France. So, I mean, in a sense, that's fairly kind of unsubtle code, really. I mean, people must have known what was being talked about, but it obviously reveals the sensitivity. The War Cabinet is actually in session when news of the French ceasefire arrives, and so this is a real-time decision-making. We think today we live in this world of very fast communication, and in some ways it's a bit faster than it was back in 1940. But at this moment, at any rate, there is this sudden, shocking arrival of a key piece of information.
And obviously, Churchill will need to comment on it. I have to give a speech that is going to make everyone believe in the project. France is gone. We're alone. We have to do this, right? Number one, he would be preparing the speech for Parliament, but surely he wants that speech to go out further.
Well, this is true. I think that people often get the impression that Churchill was on the radio practically every night. In fact, his broadcast speeches were quite rare. He was speaking a lot in the House of Commons, and his speeches took a lot of time to prepare as well. So I think that at this point where the news of the fall of France comes, Churchill's already been working on his upcoming speech for at least a couple of days. And so the question which then emerges is, as you say, it's important that Churchill be communicating with the wider public directly and not just through newspaper reports of common speeches. And so the Minister of Information, a guy called Duff Cooper, who was the rather charismatic guy in many ways, who'd resigned as a minister over the Munich Agreement back in 1938 and was now back in the cabinet, he was authorized by the cabinet to consult the Speaker of House of Commons about whether or not a Churchill speech in the House of Commons should be broadcast. Now, that might seem, well, why make such a big deal of this? And the point is that at this time, there was no radio broadcasting or any other kind of broadcasting at the House of Commons. So the idea that a kind of a microphone would have been placed down there and it would have been broadcast live would have been a complete novelty.
And so, remarkably, right, they decide not to do that.
Well, Parliament is quite tradition bound. The idea of making such a big innovation on the hoof is not really a popular one. And so actually they come back to this question a couple of other times during the war, and the answer from the House of Commons always comes back, no, you can't do this. And Churchill is sort of pretty resentful of this. But the outcome is that he actually ends up giving his 18th of June speech, which we know is the finest hour speech, twice. Once in the House of Commons, and then again over the airwaves on the radio in the evening. Again, just remember that that famous Fight on the Beaches speech also had not been broadcast. He made it in the House of Commons. He didn't go on the radio to broadcast it again, and essentially a radio announcer read out certain sections of it that evening, but it wasn't Churchill doing it. And so this was twice. He was like, why should I have to do it twice? Which is kind of a reasonable question.
It's interesting us sitting here thinking, you have arguably the greatest speaker in the history of the English language who's ready to go to bat for you, but we're not going to broadcast it. It's just so counterintuitive. So the following day at the cabinet meetings, Sir Alexander Cadogan, I butchered that, permanent undersecretary for the Foreign Office, wrote in his diary that Churchill wasn't there. He was writing his speech. So Churchill must have understood this is going to be a deeply important speech. And I think in this moment, at one of the crux of the most important speeches of the war, maybe even of the 20th century, it's important to note that Churchill has this very weird, sophisticated system of writing speeches. And I would just wonder if you have any thoughts on that, Richard, because I'm kind of fascinated with the weird way he would kind of put this out on paper. And I know
Well,
you've seen the note cards.
Well, I mean, I'm just going to add that the initial process of writing it was actually generally not by hand. It was by him dictating
Dictating.
to a typist who would even have a keyboard with sort of specially silenced keys so they didn't make too much irritating noise while he was walking up and down. So it'd be quite challenging for the typist to sometimes to catch what he was actually saying. The rough draft he would correct. It would then be, as you say, transferred to these. Well, actually, before we got to that stage, there would often be a process of sending out bits of the speech to different departments to see if they had any comments, to see whether they wanted to add or correct any statistics, if there were things which they thought that he should be saying that he wasn't saying, or was planning to say that he shouldn't be saying. And he would get these responses. Sometimes he'd react quite angrily, actually, why is this bloody fool saying this? But when the advice was good, he would generally take it. And then they would be transferred to these cards. You would sometimes see additional corrections that he has made by hand on those. And as you say, they're written out in so-called psalm form so that he could see the lines easily in front of him.
And one final silly note about that is that he had a special type of speech card so that when he designed his siren suit, which he did design, he had different size pockets on his breast made from his tailor so that one would fit his cigars and that one would fit his speech notes. That's totally true.
And that's what you have too, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's all I wear, as a matter of fact. I'm wearing a siren suit now. I really wish we had video on this thing.
So on the 18th of June, and this is 3:40 p.m., Churchill's in the House of Commons. He launches into this address, which takes 36 minutes in total. And its core purpose was to signal to the outside world Britain's inflexible resolve to continue the war.
One of the ways that I am totally amazed about this speech, and we will spend some time talking about it, is that he starts by acknowledging the colossal military disaster that France's surrender represents. And I find it very difficult to juxtapose that with speakers today who always want to kind of put a shiny polish on whatever's coming. And Churchill had this brilliant way of telling people, like, this is grim, guys. This is awful. It's also one of the things, I think you pointed this out in your book, Roar of the Lion, is that it endeared him to the people in a way because they believed what he said. He wasn't sugarcoating anything. The first thing out of the gate is, guys, we're in a rough spot.
Yeah, yeah. And he'd done this in the aftermath of Dunkirk as well, where people are trying to, a certain extent, portray this effectively very bad result as a great success. But he says wars are not won by evacuation. So there is this realism. I think that June 1940 is perhaps the high point of that realism. Perhaps this is sort of like the harshest truth telling. And I will say that there are episodes where Churchill does actually disguise or cover up bad news. The sinking of the SS Franconia, also in the summer of 1940, which the news is held back to prevent people becoming even more downhearted, and actually was never intended to suppress it permanently, but it ended up being suppressed until the end of the war. So there were times where he was polishing things to make them better, but certainly I don't remember any political leader in my lifetime coming out and saying, my God, this has been this enormous mess.
But one of the things I think that is really interesting is the next point that he makes. In the wake of how bad things have gone, Churchill says a couple things. One of those things is there are many who seek to indict those who were responsible for the guidance of our affairs. But he goes on to say, it would be foolish and pernicious if we were to open a quarrel between the past and the present. We shall find that we have lost the future. And the reason I want to pause here and consider that is because I think he's done something quite brilliant here rhetorically. He spent so much of his time accusing the Chamberlain government, and Churchill puts a stop to that and kind of says, hey, we're all on the same side. And if you remember, I just want to mention the small writing that he did on the scaffolding of rhetoric, which he did much earlier on in his life. This is absolutely pulled from that playbook, which is, hey, set aside your small squabbles. We got bigger fish to fry.
Yes, but there's also other immediate context, which is that during the summer of 1940, there is a lot of popular anger, not directed at Churchill, but directed at, remember, Neville Chamberlain is still in the War Cabinet as Lord President of the Council. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, is still there too. Both, of course, were strongly associated with appeasement. And there is this idea that if you kind of have a cleansing of the government to get rid of the appeasers, then the war effort will be conducted much more effectively. And this is also the period where some journalists, including Michael Foot, very quickly in the aftermath of Dunkirk, writing a famous pamphlet called Guilty Men. And this becomes a bestseller in part because the newsagent W.H. Smith bans it, which of course makes people just want to buy more copies. And so there's this pressure to get rid of Chamberlain, Halifax, and other perceived guilty men. And they were able to put on the cover of the book, on the dust jacket, a quotation from Churchill in 1937 saying the purpose of recrimination about the past is to ensure more effective action in the present. So he was saying at this point, let's not recriminate, guys. In the past, he'd actually been in favor of recrimination.
Well, that's interesting that his oratory was such a powerful weapon that sometimes it could be turned back on himself.
Yeah. Sort of coming back to the speech, as you say, he said this was been a colossal military disaster, but he also says, well, there are actually grounds for optimism that in the long run, victory is possible. We just don't really know when and how it's going to happen. And sometimes he points back to the First World War, say, well, I was a minister at that period, and there were kind of 4 years of pretty much stalemate on the Western Front. And then suddenly there was this Allied breakthrough.
One of the recipients of his optimism in these speeches, the RAF, and he talks about how the RAF has proven itself over the skies of Europe, that it's superior in quality, both in men and in types of machine to the Nazi Luftwaffe.
Yeah. I guess that one of the things which Churchill has to do is always throughout the war, he kind of has to spread the love, right, in terms of who he's praising, that he can't just praise one lot of people because actually then other groups of people will get upset. So he praises the soldiers. Remember that just after Dunkirk, Anthony Eden, who you mentioned before, gives a speech which launches the so-called local defence volunteers, better known under their subsequent name of the Home Guard. Now 500,000 men who've signed up, of course, in a few weeks without very much military training, then probably not going to be that effective. And indeed, he admits that only a portion of whom are actually yet armed with rifles or other firearms. So nice tribute. But as anybody who has seen the episodes of the British TV comedy series Dad's Army, this wasn't necessarily the most effective fighting force.
But also another thing that he highlights is the strength of the British Navy, which of course Britain has hung its hat on for centuries. I mean, to quote Napoleon in the movie that Ridley Scott did recently, "You guys think you're so great because you have boats."
Yeah.
Well, Churchill did think that Britain was great because it had boats. And he constantly refers to in the speech, not constantly, but occasionally, our great superiority at sea.
And I guess the other point to make is that he cites the military advisors as the heads of the three armed services, saying that they unitedly advise that the war should be carried on and there are good and reasonable hopes of final victory. So this fact that Churchill has got support from his professional advisors gives him a reason or a justification for his comment that he sees great reason for intense vigilance and exertion, but none whatever for panic or despair.
It's a remarkable balance. Then Churchill goes into the conclusion of this speech, which I think any history nerd has heard at some time or another. And I think it's such a brilliant speech, Richard. If you'll indulge me, I'd like you and I to read this speech together. Are you okay with that?
I'm very good with that. I mean, as you say, people have heard this before, but they've never heard us do it.
Exactly, which is kind of amazing. What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin.
Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war.
If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands.
But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science.
Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that, if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour.
Welcome back to Churchill, the finest half hour. I'm Richard Toye, and with me is Dr. Warren Doctor. Now, that speech, which we just read the conclusion to, as we mentioned earlier, Churchill read it twice, first in the House of Commons and then later that evening over the radio.
Okay.
But in fact, you might just assume that undoubtedly you can't criticize the rhetoric or the style or really the contents in any way, but this wasn't necessarily how it went down at the time.
So it's perhaps kind of bizarre for us looking at this from a 21st century lens, because this is such a powerful and stirring speech. But actually, at the time he did it, like almost immediately after, the opinion about the speech was quite divided.
Yes, in the House of Commons itself, the Labour Party supporters, and MPs were kind of cheering much more loudly than most of the Conservative supporters, and I think they were, realised actually that, Churchill didn't actually have complete support from the Conservative benches, who often were still loyal to Neville Chamberlain, and so they can show their patriotism and their support for Churchill, and to a certain extent, wind up the Tories or drive a wedge between them. And so, um, you know, equally, not all of the observers think that he did a brilliant job in terms of delivery.
No, one of my favorite witnesses, who was Jock Colville, was Churchill's private secretary. His notes in his diary, which is, I believe, called The Fringes of Power, is a fantastic record of Winston Churchill's life. He recorded in his diary that he went to the House and heard the PM speak on the collapse of France and the question of invasion and air bombardment here. He spoke less well than on the last occasion and referred more often to his notes, but he ended magnificently.
Yeah, and so equally, the New York Times, reporting a few days later, it says that when Churchill rose to speak, he was obviously not in his best form, that he was exhausted from sleepless nights on account of the disaster in France. Although it does say that, tired though the Prime Minister might be, he sought to instill confidence in his countrymen for the struggle ahead. So great speech, fantastic, but not for everyone.
Right, and then so as we said, he didn't record it live, for the broader public, so then he had to go to the BBC the same evening and basically give the exact same speech again.
Exactly, and as we said earlier on, he kind of resented that and might explain that he didn't put in quite as much effort as he might have done.
And some elements, thanked him for his frankness, or thought that it was good because of his frankness, and that his speech was very courageous and hopeful, but there was also a lot of a critique of his delivery.
Well, indeed, and it's just worth pausing to comment on where this information that we're quoting from comes from, so that there were, two important sources that we can use. One of which was from an organization called Mass Observation, which was a kind of sociological research organization which went around gathering popular opinion in various ways. And there was also the Ministry of Information and its so-called Home Intelligence Report. And now the interesting thing is that you can see similar messages in both, but the mass observation is a bit more frank, so that the observers are reporting that Churchill, when he gave the speech over the wireless in the evening, sounded drunk. In the Home Intelligence reports, you read that there were some complaints about the delivery,
Right.
but the official version is toning down, or disguising the fact that a number of people thought, to use a phrase that turns up in some of the reports, that Churchill had dined a little too well.
I mean, that was even picked up by the New York Times because it reported that when he later repeated his speech over the radio, it was hard for him to finish it.
Right. And actually, you can go to the Churchill Archive Centre and hear a recording of the original radio broadcast. And to be honest, it's not terrible. There is some stumbling. It's not the most perfect delivery. Some people say, well, was he maybe a little bit, or did he have a cigar in his mouth? Certainly, there's not kind of overwhelming enthusiasm. And that is also something that is reflected to some extent in the British press.
That's right. I mean, the Daily Mirror, I think, it seemed to indicate that he didn't need to worry about the resolve of the countrymen. He says, "You need not worry about the men and women of this country, Mr. Churchill. The common people of the land have the courage. Give them the arms and give them the leadership, and they will not fail as they have been failed. But above all, give them leadership." All caps.
Exactly. And even you kind of assume that brilliant speech, therefore it must have been over every single front page. It wasn't the main story in the Daily Express, for example. Actually, the Express focused on Churchill's comment that Britain had not felt able to release France from its obligations not to make a separate peace, rather than on the famous phrases. And similarly, some people, of course, heard the speech twice because they were present in the House of Commons, either as an MP or as a journalist, and then listened to it on the radio later. So, and the columnist Hannon Swaffer, writing in the Daily Herald, which is the Labour movement's official paper, claims, Winston was tired, he coughed, his utterance had none of the impressiveness of his common speech, that is to say, when he delivered it over the radio.
I guess once the initial umph of the speech was out and the kind of reviews of the speech, people were still kind of playing around with the speech and even misquoting it.
Yeah, I think the Ministry of Information do realize that it's a great speech, and they try to maximize its value in newspapers a couple of days later with the headline, "Let us brace ourselves to our duty," and then kind of gives a condensed version of Churchill's words. And so there is also, remember, these speeches have an afterlife. They get kind of quoted again and again during the war and after the war. And the version I think that you generally hear on documentaries is a version that Churchill re-recorded 9 years later when he was making a series of gramophone records of his speeches.
Well, one of the things from your book, Richard, that I took away from it about Churchill's speeches, The Roar of the Lion, is he was always very aware of his audiences. Obviously, he has his domestic audience, the audience in Parliament, the British audience, but then there are other audiences I think Churchill was constantly aware of, and one is Nazi Germany. And I wonder if you have any insight into how those audiences interpreted Churchill's words.
Remember, of course, that people in Germany were listening to foreign broadcasts illegally, so some of them may have heard the speech directly. But what we do know, and this is July actually, so kind of a month later, so I think this is not necessarily a reaction specifically to the Finest Hour speech, but more to Churchill's speeches in general. Hitler makes a speech to the Reichstag, and he points out that Churchill has reiterated his declaration that he wants to continue the war. And Hitler says, "I know that our answer, which will come someday, will bring upon the people unending suffering and misery. Of course, not upon Mr. Churchill, for he no doubt will already be in Canada." That's a kind of a repeated trope that the Nazis use to suggest that the British leadership are going to sort of run away and take refuge in the empire. Hitler continues, "I do realize that this struggle, if it continues, can only end with the complete annihilation of one or the other of the two adversaries." Well, he was right in that sense. He goes on, "Mr. Churchill may believe this will be Germany. I know that it will be Britain."
Pretty big one to get wrong for Herr Hitler. So, Richard, the power of this speech, I mean, we've discussed it, we enjoyed reading it, we've analyzed it in depth here. It's almost like this speech is so intertwined with Churchill himself. It's inspired the title of our podcast. It's one of the things that's uniquely Churchillian. What is the greater legacy of this speech?
I think you've got to remember that people consumed this in multiple different ways. So, of course, only a small number will have heard the original in the House of Commons. A large number, we know about kind of 60% of the potential audience in Britain did hear it on the radio, but then they would also have had the opportunity to read it in the newspapers. And you will find that, of course, of the millions of words which Churchill spoke during the war, not all of them by any means were recorded. It's really a limited number of sentences which get reproduced on radio and TV today. I mean, they've become memes, but they are taken out of context, which is not necessarily a criticism. Nobody can be expected to engage in a close reading of every single Churchill speech. There's no reason why people shouldn't latch on to the famous bits. But I suppose the point is that at the time, the famous quotations only worked because they were the icing on a much more substantial cake.
That's a really good analysis. But I think one of the reasons that it lives on, this particular speech, has something to do with Churchill the man, Churchill in the moment, all of those Churchillian notions, right? But also there's something maybe I think that also would have been close to Churchill's heart in that it, in a way, is an Anglophone moment. And Churchill, as we know in his History of the English-speaking peoples after the war, talks about the English-speaking peoples, and in many ways became a kind of thought leader for an Anglophone world. But I think that's one of the reasons that you see this speech live and have the legacy through history that we see, because it's become synonymous with fighting to the bitter end and good triumphing over evil and all those kinds of romantic concepts that Churchill loved and leaned on in his own rhetoric that are very much a part of the English language. And
Well, there is a famous, almost as famous as the speech itself, really, is a quotation from the American journalist Edward R. Murrow, who was present in London at the time of the Blitz in the summer of 1940. He said this famous remark that Churchill mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. So there were also those who championed Churchill, promoted and repeated his words, and encouraged them to be remembered. The threat of heavy German bombing and possible invasion hangs over Britain.
will Churchill be able to carry on mobilizing the English language and taking it into battle?
Find out how the Prime Minister confronted the great challenges facing his country in the next edition of Churchill, the Finest Half Hour.
And in the meantime, KBO.